What kind of person was Charles Darwin? Well, we can get a really good idea of that here at his rooms in Christ's College in Cambridge. What we can see is this portrait of his great hero, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was a Renaissance figure. He was a great artist, an engineer, a scientist, and he was somebody who knew about all sorts of things, incredibly curious. And that was the sort of person Darwin was. He was a very curious person. He wanted to learn about everything in nature and the human world, and he wanted to understand how it worked. Well, we can get some idea of how Darwin was working, even at this very early time, when he was just a student starting off at Cambridge, by this wonderful letter that he wrote to one of his cousins, William Darwin Fox. In the letter, he really wants to know about insects. Darwin was a great insect collector. He had one of the best collections in England by the time he left Cambridge, and was really eager to learn all the differences and all the different types that he could find. And Cambridge was a great place to look for insects. He went out into the fens and collected. He brought insects in and he identified them very closely. And he was particularly fascinated by all the differences between the different kinds of insects that you could actually see, what colors they were, how other naturalists had identified them. And one thing you can see in this letter that he writes to Fox is he's asking Fox for some information about these insects, and he says that since some of his friends have left, he doesn't have enough insect conversation. He wants to talk to other people about it. He's really dying by inches, as he says, from the lack of this conversation. This is the sort of box that Darwin would have kept his insect collection in when he was here at Cambridge. And you can see it's quite an extensive box with lots of drawers and lots of space for the wonderful collections that he made going all around the fens and other parts of Britain. When Darwin left Christ's, he had a great opportunity to go on a voyage around the world, a voyage which turned out to be 5 years long in the ship the Beagle. This gave Darwin a fantastic opportunity to follow out his interests, not just in his local area, but across the world in all sorts of different circumstances. He became really fascinated by questions about the past history of animals and plants, how they were distributed, and particularly why they were in the places they were. In other words, where do we come from? Where does the natural world come from? These were questions that could occupy Darwin for the rest of his life. When Darwin returned from the Beagle, he was really eager to settle down. For one thing, he had spent much of the time on the ship being seasick, and so the idea of having his feet on solid land sounded like a huge advantage. More than that, he had gathered vast collections when he was on the trip, and he wanted to organize those and understand those and use them to answer the big questions that he was approaching. And so he decided to get married and move to Down in Kent. A semi-rural environment, very nice house, very comfortable, and as he said, he was potentially going to just be a Kentish hog for the rest of his life. Life at Down was noisy, vibrant, and incredibly active. The Darwins had 10 children, sadly whom 3 died very young, but still, there were lots of children around, there were games, there were talk of all sorts of different subjects. The Darwin children actively participated in Darwin's work. For one thing, Darwin actually observed them as very early infants. And then after that, they would go out and help in various ways with his work. They would actually study various things that they could see around Down House and report back on what they had found. So they were active research assistants. At the same time, it's important to say that Darwin wasn't like a modern scientist. He didn't work in a research institute or a university. Darwin worked at home. But his work, nonetheless, was very serious. He had big questions to ask, and he had all sorts of detailed material to put towards those sorts of questions. It was very important for Darwin to get information from throughout the world to support his theories. And for him, the best way of doing this was through letters. Letters seem to us an old technology, but in Darwin's time, they were rapid, changing, and really an exciting way to communicate. It was very much for us like Facebook or the internet. We can see the kind of letters Darwin wrote by looking at the vast correspondence that's preserved from Darwin. Something like 15,000 letters have been preserved, involving over 2,000 different correspondents. So this was a huge part of Darwin's scientific research. We can see the kind of material that Darwin was collecting if we look at some of his correspondence that's preserved here at Christ's College, and particularly the letters that he was still writing to his cousin, William Darwin Fox. In this case, now he's not asking about insects. This time, he's asking for the skeleton of a recently dead turkey, if in fact Fox happens to find one. Darwin wanted his cousin to send him a recently dead wild turkey because he wanted to know how a wild turkey and its particular characteristics of bones would compare to that of domesticated breed, the kind that we have, say, at Christmas. These tiny differences really mattered to Darwin, and his scientific research had to be really careful and meticulous to understand exactly what those differences were. Without that, he couldn't really prove his theories or show what was involved in understanding where we came from or where these animals came from. What is Charles Darwin famous for? Darwin came up with the answer to the kind of question that he'd been tackling all his life. Where do we come from? Where do all animals and plants come from? And he did this through his grand theory of evolution. This theory explained a whole range of natural phenomena, the range of material that he'd been gathering throughout his whole life. And he did it in this book, The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, published in 1859, one of the most important books ever published. This book was the result of Darwin's lifetime of curiosity, of exploring all the nooks and crannies of the natural world, of understanding the differences, the tiny differences between individuals, and looking across the world for all these differences and bringing them together into an understanding of where we come from. Charles Darwin helped us to understand some of the biggest questions we can ask about ourselves and where we come from. It's because of that that Darwin is remembered both during his lifetime and right up to the present day. If we look at this sculpture from the great celebrations at Cambridge a century after Darwin died, we can see that Darwin's literally larger than life. The kind of questions he asked have had an influence across a huge range of different fields. Most of all, Darwin really helped us to think about how to look very carefully at tiny differences and small comparisons to answer really big questions. He taught us to be curious about the world we live in and to go out into nature and understand how things work and to understand its relationship to us. And it's through that really careful kind of research that somebody like Darwin and all the different people who contributed to his project were able to begin to answer some of the most pressing questions that we have.